So now let me invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Christian Joppke, so to share his views on neoliberal migration policy. So Professor Joppke, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you to those who invited me, but young rising scholar Takeshi Mihai. I'm humbled that you trust that coming from afar, I have something useful to say about migration policy. If you can move the slide, here's the marching order, the overview. The main argument is, I'm afraid, an academic argument, because what I'm presenting here, but I'm an academic, is a paper still under review. For 5 months now, actually, I don't have a positive answer yet, so there's no guarantee that I will not be telling nonsense to you. Bear with me. And the argument is economics and culture, or utility and identity considerations, which used to be logically and empirically separate criteria for selecting and integrating migrants, are no longer separate criteria. There is a fusion between utility and identity, a fusion between economic and cultural considerations when a state has to decide whom to admit and how to integrate migrants. And I call that new constellation, where these two previously separate criteria become blurred or fused. I call that neoliberal migration policy, also the title of this presentation. My focus here, simply because it's the focus of this little paper that I'm relying on, is on the selection side, that is on immigration policy proper. It's not my consideration to talk about the integrating of migrants, even though that is an equally important challenge. That's always the dual challenge with respect to migration, how to select and how to integrate. I only talk about the selection, and also I think that is your main interest here. But I would claim that some of the same patterns, neoliberalization, that is, can also be identified on the integration side. So 7 steps, and I hope to be in time. The first one is a bit of the academic side. I will question whether there's really a liberal paradox when states decide about migration. I will tell you what it is. It is one of the key theoretical themes underlying the scholarship on immigration policy since 30 years now, and it's closely identified with the name of esteemed colleague, Jim Holyfield, who has introduced the term. I'm not so sure the term is helpful, particularly not helpful to understand this new constellation of the fusion of previously separate criteria of selection. And indeed, the second step then is to tell you a little bit about this new constellation of blurring of the previously separate economics versus culture divide. And I try to make sense of this new empirical constellation in terms of, I think, we have a new form of nationalism that is informing states in this domain, and I call it neoliberal nationalism, also the title of a previous book of mine. And I illustrate the workings of neoliberal nationalism along 3 aspects of or 3 types of migration policy, which are also the 3 dominant criteria of how states today select migrants on the basis of we need workers for our economy, and there's a clear focus in the neoliberal order for in terms of we prefer high-skilled migrants over low-skilled migrants. And A second aspect is family migration, and a third one is asylum migration. And my claim is in all of these three dominant sectors of immigration policy, you find similar patterns of the blurring of economic and cultural considerations when you select these three different types of migrants: labor migrants, family migrants, and asylum migrants. Yeah, and I'm closing with the mandate that I got from my inviting party here to talk a little bit about the future of migration policy. As an academic, you don't talk about the future, but I try to fulfill my duty here. And lessons for Japan, I have a big question mark here, because I do think what I'm going to tell you is quite specific to the European constellation or North Atlantic constellation, and Japan is different in important respects, and perhaps you will see your own specificity in light of that rather different story I'm telling you about Europe and North America. So if you move the slide to my first point, the liberal paradox. The gray eminence for all of us political scientists or sociologists who study migration is Ari Solberg. He wrote not terribly much, but probably the best book ever on the American immigration experience over the last 150 years or so. And he's more of a historian, always very concrete and very careful not to overload his observations with too much jargon. But when he was in the mood of jargonizing a bit or kind of generalizing a bit, he argued, indeed, when states select migrants, they have two different toolboxes or selection criteria. One he called the identity axis. The other one, he didn't give it a name really, in terms of he should also call it some sort of axis. No, the approximate term I found in his work is if states don't select on the basis of are people close enough to who we are, then they select people on the basis of they are useful for us because they fulfill jobs, say, that other domestic people do not want or cannot fulfill. He called that material conditions. One could call it the economic axis, even though that is a term that you do not find in Solberg. And interestingly, it's very complex, this reasoning. He argued that each of these two axes, cultural, economic, can have two expressions. It can be restrictive, kind of closed to migration, or it can be inclusive, that is migrant-friendly, as it were. So each axis has two poles, an open, liberal pole, and a closed, restrictive pole. And yeah, he is the master of the historian of the history of American migration, and he could then show that US legal migration policy has always been dominated by identity concerns. And the big break here was 1965. Before 1965, you had an immigration policy called the National Origins System that selected migrants on the basis of their race and their ethnic origins. Newcomers had to be similar to those who were already in the US, grosso modo, North European migrants first and foremost, and less, if at all, Catholics and Jews. So this is, of course, if you select people on that basis, by origins, as I called it in one book, then this is identity driven. And also after 1965, when under the influence of the civil rights and student movements, the United States had to abandon its racist kind of identity. It became more civic liberal. Then also when a new system now was actually giving quota, country quota, an equal number of migrants from all countries in the world. And that was kind of the idea was this is not discriminatory. It is not selecting on the basis of race. Each country has the same, country in the world has the same chance to send newcomers to America. I will not talk about the subterraneous motivations, which were not so completely decoupled from racial, ethnic considerations, but also that was selecting on the basis of identity. No, America saw itself as a freedom country, as bringing liberal democracy to all over the world, and it was not a change of policy that was driven by utility, by economic considerations, but by more cultural identity considerations. Okay, that's Solberg. Masterful stuff. No, why do you move here? That was my spastic arm movements here. I will be short on this because it's a little bit too academic. Coming to the liberal paradox, Jim Holyfield introduced the term. It is motivated by a very similar consideration as Solberg, that identity and culture on the one side and economics on the other side are kind of separate criteria when states have to decide about whom to admit as a newcomer. However, in his vision or in his model, these two axes are in a way monochrome. Each axis is monochrome. The identity culture axis is always kind of restrictive. The economic axis is always inclusive. To me, this is a bit problematic and not making this notion so useful to understand real-world policies. There are two versions to the liberal paradox, and I don't think that is helpful for you to go into that. I actually have, for anyone interested, the paper, and you consult it then. I leave it with the paradox here and move on to the next slide. Yeah, several scholars, and in a way what I'm doing in this paper is not terribly original, it's kind of summarizing new insights, empirical insights by people who study contemporary migration policies. And two of these very interesting scholars is Jennifer Elric of McGill University in Canada and her Canadian-German colleague Elke Winter. They argued very much in my kind of confirming my intuition or the argument that I'm presenting here, that utility and identity, and indeed they use these two terms, are no longer, as they call it, logically distinct concerns in migration policy. And this nice little paper of the year 2017 looks primarily at recent German labor migration policy, and they interpret this policy as an instance of national middle class building. This is their term, and the primary example they discuss in this paper is Germany's new penchant or kind of drive towards admitting high-skilled migrants, which started sometime in the 1990s and was something completely new in Germany. Because before that moment, Germany was like Japan before its recent developments that my predecessor just marvelously outlined. It said, "Wir sind kein Einwanderungsland." We are not an immigration country. And that changed when there was the perceived need actually for high-skilled migrants. And according to these two scholars, this is not just a utility considerations. If Germany now moved to high-skill migration, gave up its old self-designation as not an immigration country, it was also identity-driven, that is, following the project of what they call national middle-class building. There's another example in the paper that exemplifies this national middle-class orientation of this new direction of German labor migration policy that OECD spouses, that is the spouses of mostly male migrants coming from rich, developed countries like Japan or South Korea or United States, they were exempted from the new civic integration tests that mostly global South migrants were subordinated to. In a way, their national origins, coming from rich societies, qualified them quasi-automatically for middle-class status. So there was a fusion here, a fusion in this labor migration policy of Germany in this point of time, very recently, of class or utility and nationalist or identity considerations. And another set of very perceptive migration scholars today, Saskia Bonjour, who is actually a colleague of Hein de Haas at the University of Amsterdam, and Sébastien Chauvin, who works at the University of Lausanne, very close to Bern. They summarize the same observation. They argue in the current, they call it nationalist neoliberal context. They don't call it really neoliberal nationalism. They don't really dwell much on the meaning of this combination here of nationalist and neoliberal. In this context, the policy distinction between cultural and economic criteria is increasingly blurred. And they argue the good citizen from the perspective of the state who rules over society, selects migrants, is the good citizen is a worker citizen. The worker citizen, that's a term that comes from yet another interesting scholar. I will not go into much of name dropping here. The worker citizen, here it's not really important what, in a way, the passport of that, then metaphorically speaking, citizen is. The worker citizen, an individual who's productive and useful in society, can be either a citizen in the narrow term of passport holding, or it can be an immigrant. Okay, I come back to that theme later. Therefore, I think now we can move to our next slide. And I have to consider time constraints. Would have never thought that. Yeah, I call that constellation that makes sense of these empirical observations. I call it neoliberal nationalism. Generally, one has to say, nationalism is a necessary input factor for all migration policy. Migration policy is a policy that shapes and determines who is to be a member, a new member of our society. And countries, in a way, do this, or states do this membership policy. I follow here a nice argument by the American philosopher Michael Walzer. They select newcomers in the image of who are we. We want to maintain who we are. Immigration policy is in the service of maintaining and sustaining communities of character. This is Japan. This is Luxembourg. It's not MacMall. Now, neoliberal nationalism, this new type, is neither civic nor ethnic. These are the two dominant types in the literature on nations and nationalism. Civic, the classic example is France. Ethnic, the classic example is Germany. No, neoliberal nationalism is neither nor. It raises the question, what is neoliberal? Now, colloquially speaking, neoliberal is to economize everything. Not just things, but people included. The famous billionaire investor George Soros spoke of market fundamentalism. If kind of market principles are not just at home in their original domain of the market, but dominate education, dominate politics, even shape the subjectivity of people. to responsibilize, to make the individual self-responsible so that society is not required to intervene. That's a typical motif in that literature that reflects on what is neoliberal, the building of human capital. The idea is if education, previously education was to educate citizens, well-rounded, integrated people. Now the new idea of education, and in particular higher education, is to get a good job, to make myself sellable on labor markets, to build human capital. So that is kind of, intuitively speaking, the meaning of neoliberal, to economize everything, to spread the market throughout society. Friedrich Hayek, in my view, is the greatest theorist of neoliberalism. He denied the neo. For Friedrich Hayek, what he wrote about in his 50-year writing career, marvelous, productive writer actually, he thought he just reconstructed the original classical liberalism. No, he did not. Hayek was concerned about social liberalism, that liberalism turned into something like social democracy, that it became closely allied with democracy. He hated social justice. He hated welfare. He thought the individual is responsible for herself. And if she fails, there is nobody there to the rescue, except perhaps her family. Individual justice, not social justice. Margaret Thatcher, who brought neoliberalism down from the sky of the philosophers like Hayek to the real world, she said, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and their families, and there's no state that people should look for to help them out if they are in need. No such thing as society. That is also a good description of the meaning of the neoliberal doctrine. Here, however, a few self-critical remarks. If you want the general ethics of all of immigration, is neoliberal before the word. One of the earliest provisions in American federal immigration policy, which originated only in the late 19th century, was the so-called deeming provision. Arie Solberg, whom I started with today, wrote very prolifically about deeming. What is deeming? Deeming was the idea that if an immigrant passes Ellis Island, then she had to, or it was mostly a he, even though a lot of families moved at the time as well, find a relative, say in New York, who would sign a little paper, an affidavit, saying, if my relative just coming from Italy or from Slovenia, if she falls destitute, then I will take care of her. That is deeming. In a way, it's a privatizing of social aid. And you see, only if an immigrant to late 19th century America was self-sufficient, economically useful, was she considered a if she was sick and the teeth was shown to be inflicted with a disease, you go back anyway. So that was rough and utility-oriented, if anything. So one should be careful not to overdraw the meaning of neoliberal here. All ethics of immigration, in a way, has been neoliberal before the word. I also have to say, neoliberal nationalism, this strange neologism as an ideology, is very strange. This is what Philip Mano said, actually, in a review of one of my earlier books, which was with the title of Neoliberal Nationalism. Why is it a strange compositum to square neoliberal with nationalism? First, the neoliberals, now the doctrinaires like Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke and others, sometimes considered and called the Geneva School, in a great work by the American historian Quinn Slobodian, they were globalists. They didn't like the nation state. They didn't like nationalism was too narrow for them. They actually feared nationalism, that they feared the nation state, because the nation state is a typical site, and still today, of democracy. People rule themselves. That's the meaning of democracy, the demos rules. And the nation state, in a way, had to be sidelined for capital to move freely and unburdened across borders. The people, the demos, the nationalists were kind of a threat to property, and therefore the Geneva School neoliberals, they looked for new types of polity, like actually the European Union, which were more like an interstate federation, as Friedrich Hayek called it in an early, very ingenious work. And Hayek himself, first, of course, he ranted against anything social and socialist, but he also ranted against, or argued against, and mobilized and yelled against nationalism. He called it threat to a free civilization. So one has to put that into consideration here. This is a very bizarre creature, neoliberal nationalism. It grates in the ear. And if you could now move the slide, that is at the level of doctrine. In the real world, however, I think one can observe that thing that I call such, N for neoliberal nationalism. It is the idea we are a community of the thrifty. Thrifty means productive, useful, not cost factors. And who is excluded here from the community of the thrifty? On the one side, lazy citizens, and on the other side, costly migrants who only come to us for abusing our marvelous social aid and welfare system. So the community of the thrifty excludes lazy citizens, but includes productive immigrants. The community of the thrifty, which is another more colloquial wordage for neoliberal nationalism, blurs the boundaries, the previously strict boundaries between citizens on the one side and immigrants on the other side. No, not yet. No, here, stay with that. And policy examples of this real existing neoliberal nationalism is social policy that has recently moved from welfare to workfare. America, Britain under Reagan and Thatcher respectively, pioneered that Gerhard Schröder, German Chancellor, belatedly joined the train. Tony Blair, of course, with New Labour as well in the 1990s. Social policy, I will not say more about that. Citizenship policy is another instance of neoliberal nationalism. There was a moment in not too long ago Europe that citizenship was considered a right if an immigrant fulfilled certain prerequisites, such as residence time or language competence. It was a right if certain conditions were fulfilled. The new rhetoric, roughly since the 1990s, is it's not a right, it's a privilege. It's a privilege that you have to earn. Citizenship is not something that helps you to better integrate. That is the old liberal social notion. No, the new neoliberal notion is citizenship has to be earned. I talk about it in that book, older book of mine, under the title of Neoliberal Nationalism and related articles. And a third example, of course, is immigration policy, the topic of today. Brubaker, esteemed colleague from UCLA, has actually discarded nationalism as an input factor in immigration policy. He thought only citizenship, not immigration policy, is kind of shaped by nationalist considerations. I myself have taken this position in an earlier book, and I will not bother you with that. What I do in the next slide is to simply elaborate on neoliberal nationalist motifs shaping three types of contemporary immigration policy for the high-skilled, family, and asylum. I can be very short about high-skilled migration here. To a degree, of course, its origins are simply the new era of globalization in which there is a race for talent, as my colleague Yelet Shahar put it in a nice article early on. This simply need in a kind of technologically ever more advanced economies for IT specialists, and they are predominantly to be found in Bangalore, India. At least that was the earliest mythology. So there is a very economic consideration here. It's not just the kind of a nationalist, however, neoliberal nationalist consideration. It's both of these factors. We'll not talk about the EU, which is an example of this combination here of economic, knowledge-based economy and identity considerations. We want social cohesion. And indeed, when Elke Winter, I already mentioned her, introduced this notion of middle-class nation building, she primarily exemplified it along high-skilled migration. Canada is an excellent example for that. I will not bother you with that detail here. Read the paper, and I think we can move on to the second type of contemporary migration policy that is shaped by neoliberal nationalist motifs, which is family migration. If you can move the slide. Yeah, generally, of course, family migration I always thought is immensely fascinating, because this is a type of migration that is both individual rights based, and it is something relevant for the interests of receiving states. Family migration happens because families are simply protected entities in liberal state constitutions. However, family migration can also be new seed immigration, as it was called in the 1970s, when Europe stopped accepting guest workers because of the first and most serious economic recession of the post-war era. Then most people actually who were still coming in were the family members of the guest workers. And so there was a feeling that if we allowed too many of them, our recruitment stop will simply be undermined. People abuse family migration for continued and then ever more perpetuated new seed immigration. Now, in a social democratic regime, the family would be considered a support factor for, say, male labor migrants who already arrived in a country of destination. It's good for integration. In a neoliberal context, the family is considered not a support factor, but a cost factor. And under this lens, or from within this optic, there have been restrictive trends to cut down family migration whenever since ever it became a rather important new channel for migration. And still today, the majority of migrants who arrive in Europe are not labor migrants, not asylum migrants, they are family migrants. So if you want to get serious about restricting migration, then you have to restrict family migration. And that was done in various ways, raising the income level of the sponsor already residing, say, in Germany or in France. She had to show I earn a lot of money and I can support my spouse and my children. You raise the income levels. You have to demonstrate that your apartment is big enough so that you're not crowded, not as small as the hotel room that I enjoy here in Tokyo. Another restrictive trend is, and that's very interesting, because remember, the dominant trend of this neoliberal nationalism is the blurring of the citizen-immigrant distinction. And previously, citizens had more family rights than settled immigrants. It was easier for them to bring in spouses from abroad, spouses of a different nationality. Also, settled immigrants have certain family rights, but they tended to be weaker and lesser than the family rights of citizens. And in countries like Germany and France, you can see a leveling down of these previously privileged citizens to the level of immigrants. And interestingly, very often driven by the demographic new constellation, that a lot of claims makers for family formation and family unification, from a certain point on, roughly 1990s, were former immigrants, are naturalized French or Germans. So in fact, if you level down citizen rights here in that family domain, you actually level down the rights of previous immigrants. So, okay, this is an interesting trend here. And thirdly, highly interesting is that high-skilled immigrants in European countries like Germany and France, they have more family rights than citizens. And the countries that have been examined in this respect here is the UK, Norway. Also here you see almost certain foreigners are treated better than citizens if it comes to family migration rights. Okay, I don't need the case of Canada here. I can move on to the next slide. Asylum migration. Now, here, there is a trend of economizing asylum migration, which is quite recent and quite new. And it has both a plus and a minus side. The minus side, to begin with it, is this trend to look at asylum migration increasingly from an economistic perspective. It is restrictive for recognized refugees recognized under the Geneva Convention, who are increasingly treated like ordinary labor migrants. And previously, refugees were put on a higher pedestal. They had more integration rights and more easier residence rights than labor migrants. And it is inclusive. This trend to economize asylum migration is inclusive for rejected asylum seekers. And one must know, in Europe, in most European countries, the number of recognized convention refugees is much smaller than the number of asylum seekers whose claims are rejected, but who cannot be deported, kicked out for other reasons. I go to it in a second. So neoliberal asylum migration means that asylum, to the degree that it's still granted, is no longer primarily a right, but it is increasingly charity. It's done for humanitarian reasons, not for respecting a rights title on the part of the claimant. There's one side to it that is from right to charity, and there's another side to it that is just crudely economistic. The CEO of Daimler-Benz, big German upper middle class car maker in 2015, which was the moment of the big Syrian refugee crisis when about 1 million Syrian refugees arrived in Germany. He welcomed that. He said, hey, most refugees are young, they are well educated, they are highly motivated. In response to that big incoming of about 1 million Syrians and others under that same, in that same moment, the Germans passed a so-called integration law simply to adjust the law to the new situation. Interestingly, that was written by the McKinsey consultancy. That is only mentioned here in brackets. And what this new law did is, on the one side, it reduced the rights of recognized refugees. They were now demoted, as I say, to the status of ordinary legal migrants. Permanent residence was no longer given to them automatically after they were recognized as refugees, fulfilling this criteria of political fear of persecution. They had to submit themselves to the usual civic integration tests. If they wanted to have permanent residency, even convention refugees, they had to pass a language test and the civics integration requirement that labor migrants had to undergo. But on the other side, that's kind of the minus side from the point of view of the asylum seeker or the refugee. On the plus side, there was a new legal term introduced in that law. It's called good prospect to remain. And it gives all asylum seekers, in whatever phase of the asylum process they are, from day one on, in a way, if they have a good prospect to remain, and that was simply defined by the probability that she would actually be granted refugee status. So if you came from Syria or from Afghanistan, the recognition right for refugees is very high. So her prospect to remain is very high. Such asylum seeker was immediately kind of given integration support. And finally, there was also a so-called track change for rejected asylum seekers. That's a complicated thing I cannot go into, otherwise I would. I see my time is running here like mad. So summing up, neoliberal asylum migration is double-edged. Economization, this whole prospect to increasingly look at asylum seekers from the point of view of utility, it blurs the labor-asylum distinction. It is good for rejected asylum seekers who are kind of track changed to the labor migration track, but it may also create false incentives to claim asylum only in the hope that eventually, okay, my asylum claim will be rejected, but I will be admitted as a labor migrant, as it were. That is the purpose behind track change. I have written about it, and I will not further dwell on it. And the second problematic side here is humanitarianism undercuts the rights basis of asylum seeking. There are several examples to it, which I will not go into because my time is lapsing. There's an Italian scholar, Marvelli, who teaches, Luca Marvelli, who teaches somewhere in England. He said the connection between these two sides, the double edge, as it were, economization on the one side and humanitarianism on the other side, is there is the reality of a new neoliberal political economy of belonging. That is his word for neoliberal nationalism. Okay, you can move the slide. Yeah, summing up in terms of a question, is neoliberal immigration policy middle-class building or middle-class nation building, as Elke Winter suggests? Yes and no, and in the end, I'm kind of undecided on that. I give you the yes signals. Economic class considerations have held entry across selection criteria, no longer just labor migration, where they were always, but also increasingly in family and in asylum migration. And of course, the whole vision of middle class is a classless vision, a vision of society beyond class, so it reduces the classic tension that exists between class and nation as competing affiliations of people in political terms. In that respect, middle-class nation building, as Elke Winter calls it, is an instance of what I call neoliberal nationalism, which is indeed centered on this idea of the community of the thrifty, of the worker citizen. There's a nice formulation of that in a work by the Israeli philosopher, political theorist Yael Tamir. She says, has to be very carefully read here, elites have broken the very first rule of social solidarity. Members come first. Because under neoliberal nationalism, certain migrants are even privileged over own citizens. But then, perhaps not, perhaps middle-class nation building is not so good a term for these new developments that I empirically elaborated here very briefly. No, because explicit nation-building concerns one does not find in migrant selection, but in migrant integration, which I have not covered here at all. Therefore, I will no longer dwell on that point. You know, the middle class, the Western middle class, is the loser of globalization. You see it in terms of the famous elephant curve of the economist Branko Milanovic. And it would be an ultimately cynical enterprise to kind of rebuild the middle class that has disappeared with respect to natives, to replace it with foreigners. It would actually be a full example of this crazy right-wing phantasma of the grand remplacement, of the great replacement that conspiratorial elites are putting on ordinary, hapless people to let in a lot of immigrants in order for despised co-nationals to suffer even more. This is a topic in radical right political fantasy, la grande remplacement. I will not further go into that. There's another objection to looking at neoliberal immigration policy from the point of view of middle-class nation building. Yeah, indeed. In countries like Canada, even the high-skilled immigrants that they want and wanted as one of the first countries starting in the 1960s, they subject even high-skilled people to a probationary period. You have to test yourself first before you can establish permanent residence. The new reality in Canada is so-called two-step migration. You are first, even if you're super high-skilled, admitted on a temporary basis, and you have to prove over time that you deserve to stay here. Catherine Dauvergne, a colleague from the University of British Columbia, a lawyer, she calls that new model the loss of settlement. Migrants are no longer wanted as future citizens, as it was before. No, they're just widgets in the machine of neoliberal capitalism. And all of that, summing it up, to use these grand terms like neoliberal nationalism, like middle-class nation building, it suggests there's a great design, a grand design behind what states are doing. In reality, migration policies in the plural are patchwork. They don't follow a coherent philosophy. There's a lot of contingency and randomness to them. And finally, to my second last slide, the real interest for you, lessons for Japan. Now, in my view, the European challenge is to more clearly and cleanly separate labor migration from asylum migration. because the recent trend has been to blur the distinction between both. From the point of view, you know, we have 900,000 rejected asylum seekers in Germany. We cannot get rid of them for all sorts of logistical, legal reasons. Better to integrate them. Okay, but if you drive this integration noble intention too far, you create false incentives for people to abuse the asylum process only to find a better life. And excuse me, the Geneva Convention was not written for all the downtrodden and exploited people in the world to find a better life, but it was written to protect those who are politically persecuted. Very narrow focus that should not be abandoned. Otherwise, you abandon just the separate legal regime of asylum and refugee migration. So the European challenge is to separate these two types of migration that have become fused. And that is not an issue in Japan, because of your island geographic constellation, you're not overwhelmed by asylum seekers to the same degree as Europeans are. The Japanese challenge actually is to further institutionalize labor migration policies. That Europe have been doing since the roughly early 1990s, since Germany abandoned its old logo, we are not an immigration country. You are 30 years backward in that respect, and your task is to open up to labor migration to the same degree that Germany in the last 30 years has opened up to it. So a completely different constellation in Japan, not comparable with Europe. And the big mistake of the progressives, the left-leaning, most migration scholars are left-leaning, in Europe is to consider asylum and labor migration as communicating vessels. So if you open the tap for labor, then the assumption is you reduce the demand for asylum. That is naive and empirically speaking wrong, because you're dealing with two types of people who are addressed by either asylum or labor migration policy. Liberal labor migration always needs to be complemented by restrictive asylum policies. That is the lesson of the last 20 years and the big struggles that Germany and other European countries have with respect to asylum migration today. There's an inevitable goal conflict. On the one side, you have to control migration, particularly irregular, unwanted migration, and sorry to say, asylum migration as it's happening today is part of that, and integration. If you do too much on the integration side, as the German progressives called it, integration for all from day one, then you are opening your country to migrants that actually may become a danger to your security, as the Germans had to experience last year when there were a lot of knife attacks, terrorist knife attacks in public places like supermarkets, Christmas markets, by rejected asylum seekers who should have been deported but were not deported for legal reasons, for sheer oversight of the responsible authorities and other reasons. I think I spare myself the last slide, which is simply laying out the defunctness of Europe's asylum system, something that is in dire need to be fixed. In my view, the inevitable future of asylum in Europe is to externalize the migration, the asylum process to third countries. A total scandal from the point of view of the progressive migrant scholar. However, no alternative. And there are several models of doing that. There's a model Rwanda that has failed because high courts in the UK have prohibited it. It would simply It would simply ship all those who still arrive on rickety boats, expel them immediately to Rwanda, and Rwanda then is supposed to make an asylum determination process that corresponds to the Geneva rules. And these people, once they are even accepted as refugees under the Geneva Convention in Rwanda, have no right to move on to the UK. It's a very rough model, very similar to what Australia has actually pioneered in these island outlets west of the continent. And there's a model Albania, what Italy is practicing right now. They build certain detention centers. They ship people who arrive in Italy on boats if they are young and male. Majority of asylum seekers in Europe is young and male and under 35. They ship them to Albania, and there will be an asylum determination process very much influenced by European rules. And if you're successful, actually you are entitled to move to Italy. So it's a very different model. It's a much more generous model, even though it's pioneered by Giorgia Meloni, who is originally a radical right populist politician. She mellowed in office very much. And very importantly, the whole thrust of contemporary European migration policy, and there is a new migration pact that after many years of big struggle between member states has been passed, will come into effect next year in 26. And one element of it is the so-called border procedure, which would make a very fast-paced determination if someone's asylum request is valid or not. And there will be the fiction that at the border where this whole process is to be started and quickly coming to an end, you are not yet on European or whatever is the member state territory. That lawyers called it the no entry fiction, which is very important because if you have not yet entered European territory, you are not considered subject to national law and European Union law, which is very, very protective of asylum seekers. Because in a way, the reality is, once you manage to put your foot into a European country, you can only with great difficulties be removed. Therefore, if you want to bring back control over the asylum system, you have to neutralize the legal constitutional overprotection that exists as a result of lawmaking and as a result of judicial interpretation, what is the law. And in my view, this border procedure, where you will not be granted entry, and if you are in most cases rejected as an asylum seeker, you are not allowed to move further. To me, this is only an intermediary step to the externalization of the asylum process, where indeed the asylum process will be done outside of the shores of the European Union. This is very controversial reasoning, I'm aware of it. Some of my colleagues who have proposed that there's no alternative to it, like Ruth Koopmans, who teaches at the Science Center in Berlin, they are kind of excommunicated from the overall progressive migration scholar community, if you want to call it that way. I commend the audacity and the courage of people like Koopmans to kind of call the spade by its name. All of these things do not matter for Japan, therefore I will leave it with that. And I finish even 3 minutes before my allotted time. Thank you very much.